All right, so I ended up coming back to school in the afternoon like I always do, and so I ended up making this video while I was at school instead of at home. So yesterday we started reading about ancient Africa long ago, Africa in the olden times, and talking about some of the geographical features. That was what we started with, and we talked about some of the early civilizations in Africa. The land of Cush, the mountains of Ethiopia, about Frumentius, about King Lalibela that carved 10 churches from solid rock. Should have read that yesterday. That's going to be on a quiz. Early Christians in North Africa, page 124 on the right-hand column, is where you're going to start reading today under comprehension check. Northern Africa along the Mediterranean Sea became one of the strong centers of the Christian church shortly after the time of Christ. Simon of Cyrene is remembered as the man who carried the cross for Christ. When Jesus had been arrested and sentenced to death, to be crucified, they made him carry his own cross. First, he had been flogged. A lot of people didn't even survive being flogged. Being flogged would be being whipped with a whip that had bits of glass or shards of metal in it, and it literally ripped the flesh off the person's back. So a lot of people didn't even survive being flogged. Then, of course, Jesus would have had the crown of thorns stuck on his head. And anytime you have, and we're talking thorns like we're talking thorns like this, that would have like dug into his scalp. So he would have been bleeding heavily from his scalp. He was spit at, he was mocked. He would have been in an extremely, extremely weak state by this point. And so he then is sentenced to be crucified. So Matthew 27, the guards take him, they flog him, they put the crown of thorns on him, they spit on him, and took the staff and struck him on the head, which would have pushed it down into his scalp even more. After they had mocked him, they took off the robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him away to crucify him. As they were going out, they met a man from Cyrene named Simon, and they forced him to carry the cross, because Jesus would have had to have carried his cross, but he was too weak. And so they see this guy, this man Simon, who is from Cyrene, which is in Africa, and are like, here, you carry the cross. And so he ends up carrying the cross for Jesus until they get to Golgotha, or they came to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Calvary, it goes by a couple of different names where Jesus was crucified. So, that's who the Simon of Cyrene is there. Cyrene is an African city just across the Mediterranean Sea from Greece. So I don't know if this guy was originally from Cyrene and he had moved there, or if he was just visiting because it was the Passover. And any Jewish person who could make it to Jerusalem was supposed to come to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. But he ends up carrying the cross. And once again, if he goes back home to Cyrene, he's going to tell everybody about what he saw. One of the leaders of the African church, Athanasius the Great, boldly proclaimed that Jesus is God. When some church people were doubting Christ's deity, he was one of the greatest leaders in all of church history. During the Middle Ages, Arab Muslims conquered the Christians in northern Africa. Most of the Christians moved to Europe, and by AD 700, northern Africa was almost completely occupied by Arab Muslims. And that's still true today. When you think about Egypt, it is largely an Arab nation. This is going to be an ongoing thing from this time when the Arabs moved in. Important centers of trade. Then it goes on and talks about some East Coast trading cities. Like we said yesterday, the interior of Africa, or the middle of Africa, was known as the Dark Continent because there wasn't a lot known about it. But up above the Sahara Desert, the northern part up close to the Mediterranean Sea, you would have had lots of great cities that would have been important for trade, especially Carthage. We talked about Carthage when we talked about the Phoenicians, but there would have been others. Then you read about some other empires, African empires of this time, the Ghana Empire and the Mali Empire. Then talks about the southern kingdoms. And then early achievements. Africans were skilled metal workers. They invented a smelting furnace. A smelting furnace would have been, smelting is what you do with metals like gold and iron to purify it, and a process for making cast iron. Africa is known as the home of animal tales. Aesop is a Greek slave who wrote the famous fables, may have come from Ethiopia. And then he may have come from Ethiopia and then ended up in Greece as a slave. But he's the one that if you were here in elementary school, you read Aesop fables. He's the one that did like the lion and the mouse, where the lion saved the mouse, didn't eat the mouse, and then later the mouse was able to return the favor by getting the thorn out of the paw, or the one that something about a crow putting stones in the pitcher to get the water to come up so he could drink it. That's Aesop. That's Aesop's fables. 8.3, the age of exploration and missions. The white man's grave. Before 1800, Europeans were familiar with only the outer edges of Africa, like we said, not in the middle. During the 1800s, Europeans led by skillful African trailblazers explored most of the interior of the continent. The task was extremely difficult. The intense heat, the dense vegetation, and such dangerous tropical diseases as malaria, yellow fever, and sleeping sicknesses took their toll on so many explorers and missionaries that Africa became known as the white man's grave. None but the very brave were suited for the exploration of this great land. Another thing that made Africa dangerous was the slave trade. Africans raided other tribes and carried people away to sell to Arab and Portuguese traders. These traders packed the captives onto ships and resold them as slaves to people in Asia and the New World. Many Africans owned slaves themselves, and they caught slaves for the traders. But they also despised the foreign slave traders because they thought more money than of people. The slave traders were often extremely cruel. Africans suspected any white man who came to their land of being slavers, and they often made life difficult for the European explorers and missionaries. Africa at this point is controlled by just a whole bunch of different tribes. And so the tribes don't like slavery, but they like money more than they care about people. So they're willing to sell people from another tribe to Europeans to be slaves, just to make money, and also to get rid of their enemy tribe, as it was. But they also didn't like the people they were selling the slaves to. So it was a very dangerous, difficult time. Plus you have all the diseases like malaria, which comes from mosquitoes. Some of Africa's greatest missionaries and explorers came from Scotland. And so you'll read about James Bruce, the first European explorer of Africa, James Bruce, and then read about Robert Moffat. And that's where you'll end, is after having read about Robert Moffat. So you'll read from the right-hand column of 124 to the end of 127, and then we'll pick up on Monday with David Livingstone. I went over some of it, read some of it, but it's your job to read all of it. So have a great weekend, and I will see you Monday.